his normal duties, which include teaching English primarily. And he's one of the wrestling coaches. That's how I got to know Ed. He was an assistant wrestling coach when my second son came through. He's been writing a book on the side, which he recently published. So Ed received a BA from Furman University, a master's from the University of Virginia, and a PhD from the Graduate Creative Writing Program at Florida State. So he's going to talk about his book that he published, I guess, last January, called Only Love Can Break Your Heart. And it's Ed's birthday. So we always let whoever's birthday speak.
Thanks, brother. Thanks, Jody. That was so much gentler than I was afraid it might be. Well, since Brad's not here, I think I'm going to tell a story about him as I get started. I've been very fortunate in the process of the experience I've had over the past year or so with the publication of this book, because Brad's been incredibly supportive of that, and I'm really grateful for it. Early December last year, when we were kind of getting ready to roll the book out, it was the morning after the state championship football game, and I had made an appointment. We had a late start that morning, and I had an appointment to meet with this young woman who was a journalist who was going to interview me for an online publication called Salon.com. And so we scheduled a meeting at about 8:30 at Dose, with a coffee shop right up on Murphy Road here. And so I got there, and I was standing in line, and I looked around, and there's Brad Joya, and he was there with a couple of his buddies. And I said, "Hey, Brad, how's it going?" And we chatted for a minute, and then this young woman shows up, and we're standing in line, and we sit down, and I say to her, I said, "Hey, listen, I just have to let you know, my boss is sitting right behind me. My boss right over there." And she said, "Your boss?" And I was like, "Yeah, the headmaster at Montgomery Bell Academy." And she said, "Oh, well, I have a son at Harding." And I said, "Well, great. Well, let me introduce you. Might get you the hookup here. He's a good guy to know." So when we talked for a minute, and I turned around and I looked for Brad, and he was gone. And I was like, "Well, that's strange, because it's not like Brad to just get up and walk out without." I figured he'd come over and say hello, probably want to introduce himself, a pretty social guy. And then I see Brad's car speeding out of the parking lot. And I thought, and then I looked over at this young woman, this journalist, and she's a pretty attractive young woman. And I thought, oh my God. Brad thinks I'm stepping out on my wife, and he just busted me. How am I going to explain this? Surely Brad doesn't think I'd be dumb enough to take my girlfriend for a coffee date at a coffee shop less than a mile away from the school. But then I came to find out later that afternoon that the reason that Brad had left was because he was beginning to experience really, really bad symptoms, and that by the time I found out this news, he was in the hospital, and they had just discovered the tumor in his abdomen and were beginning to run tests. And it was a kind of a frightening moment for our community, because we depend so much on his leadership. But I have to say that the news of Brad's illness came as a great relief to me, because I knew that was why he had left, and not because he discovered me in extramarital shenanigans. But I do want to just reiterate, I'm sorry that he's not here for me to again publicly thank him in person for the support that he's given to me to really experience fully the opportunity of going around and sharing this book with a lot of different people around the country, and also with you today. I'm really grateful to be able to do that. I'm going to just talk to you guys a little bit about how I came to write this book, and in the process of doing it, a little bit about the book and about me, because that's sort of natural to to my story, to how it all came. And when I started putting together words and thinking about where this book really happened for me, I came to the conclusion that writing had made me a reckless driver. During a single 5-month period, I had 4 minor accidents and a dozen near misses. I rear-ended a Lexus SUV, I backed into a Dodge Charger right out in the parking lot right out of here. Pulled out in front of a Ford Taurus coming off an exit ramp on the 440. One morning, I hit my wife's parked car when I was pulling out of the driveway. On the 440, I would fail to monitor how fast or how slow I was going, change lanes without checking the blind spot or remembering to use my turn signals. I grew accustomed to honking horns and snarling faces and upraised middle fingers. My insurance premiums went through the roof. What was wrong with me? I wasn't getting behind the wheel after knocking back shots like some character in some outlaw country song. On the contrary, my outlaw ways had long since yielded to respectable middle-class adulthood. I'd outgrown most of my vices. The few remaining I'd dramatically curbed all but one: the desire to write novels. To satisfy this increasingly dubious obsession alongside life's more pressing requirements, I'd undertaken what most non-writer types would consider an absurd routine. Monday through Friday, I woke at 3:30 in the morning so I could write until 6:30, when I'd hastily shower and dress, help get the kids ready for school, and hurry over to be in my classroom in time for extra help session. On school nights, I'd try to be in bed at 9:30, but even if I got home late after a midweek wrestling match in Wilson County or some other work-related function like, say, parents' night, I answered the alarm the next morning and went downstairs to work. I believe my life as a writer was like a shark's. If I stopped swimming, it would die. So I pushed on, regardless of how much sleep I could get, frequently driving to work perilously tired, not much safer to the world than if I'd been hanging out on Willie Nelson's tour bus. When I decided in my teens that I wanted to be a writer, it seemed simple. You just make a story up, send it off, it becomes a bestseller, Hollywood comes calling, you get rich and famous, and every girl who ever broke your heart spends the rest of her life wondering what might have been. Things did not go as planned. I kind of knocked around and floundered a little bit in my 20s. Eventually, I ended up in grad school in the writing program at Florida State, where my habits improved, though I still lacked a clear sense of purpose beyond the desire to be a writer of what I call the manly man ilk, whatever that means. My heroes were Cormac McCarthy and Robert Stone, Dennis Johnson and Bob Shikochis, who was my mentor at Florida State, to whom I attached myself like a remora. McCarthy and Johnson and Stone and Shikochis wrote about busted drug deals, hideous violence in the Mountain West, dirty CIA agents, doomed love affairs, and exotic locales between stoic antiheroes and beautiful but tormented women. I spent a summer with Shikochis at his compound in the mountains of northern New Mexico, and another alone rambling around south of the border on my own, and began working on a novel about an alcoholic ADA and an ex-con Vietnam vet who get caught between drug dealers and the corrupt local sheriff of a land-grant town in northern New Mexico. After the first year of grad school, I met the love of my life, whose only flaw was being romantic enough to marry a starving artist. Her parents accepted me politely, but with understandable reluctance. A writer, they said? What's he written? We didn't care. We were in love, and I was going to be a novelist. My wife maintained the role of the primary breadwinner while I worked on the PhD and kept pecking away at the magnum opus. A few years later, a baby was on the way, and I was ABD, all but dissertation, with an unfinished novel and a pauper's salary teaching as an adjunct. We both wanted out of Florida, and I wanted to spend holidays at my in-laws without feeling like a deadbeat. I'd briefly taught independent school before, and so I knew how that world worked, and I had a few connections. So I went to the hiring fair at the NAIS convention where I met Brad Joya, who saw something in me. This was my first experience of the famous Brad Joya decisiveness. Within a few minutes, Brad had Jennifer Howell book tickets for my wife and I to Nashville for a campus visit, and a few days after, I accepted an offer to come to MBA. That was in 2007, so to date it for you, Brad still had his BlackBerry back then. I'm sure some of you guys remember that. My writer pals warned me that teaching high school would mean the death of my dream, but I refused to be thwarted. It took a few years, working mostly in the summers, but I finally finished my doctorate in the novel, which was good enough to interest a very prominent agent. Despite the occasional bit of encouraging feedback, however, the book did not sell. I'd worked on that for about 7 years. My agent had warned me that she didn't always get a sale, but I'd been so sure of myself. The book had all the stuff I thought was cool. Hard drinking and hard drug use, graphic violence worthy of a Tarkington film, hard, stoic men being manly in the mountains. What went wrong? Try again, my agent told me. You're still young. Was I wondered? I was just about to turn 37. One afternoon, my wife and daughter came home from a play date with a preschool classmate and her mother. You won't believe what she said to me, my wife said. What? I asked. How's Ed? My wife said, aping the woman's condescending sarcasm. Still working on the great American novel? Well, nothing wakes you up faster than a good slap in the face. One more shot, I thought. If you can't pull this off before you turn 40, it's time to move on. So I doubled down and began again. I implemented that ludicrous writing schedule I was talking about before, finished the draft in less than a fifth of the time it'd take me to write the first one. My agent started sending it out. There's a quick flurry of interest. I thought we were about to have a good deal really within about a week or two of putting it out, but nothing came through. My agent, who'd already sunk hundreds of hours into my life for nothing, not a cent at that point, and hence will be my hero for life, remained hopeful. I have a good feeling about this one, she told me. Have faith. 6 months later, with no contract in sight, I could feel my 40th birthday bearing down. The clock of my writing life ticking louder and louder, creeping toward the end of youth and the expiration of hope. Driving to work one day, bleary-eyed and defeated, I send up a half-hearted, ironic prayer. Dear God, I said, please, if you just let me have a book contract before I turn 40, I'll age gracefully, I swear. I'll take it like a man. Almost instantly, the cab of my truck filled up with blue light. I thought, God? Then I pulled to a stop and sat there, fuming silently while a mercilessly impassive police officer wrote me a speeding ticket. That is a true story. Now, anyone who's ever worked seriously at writing fiction has some version of this story. The same story of sacrifice, of time and relationships, crippling self-doubt, the failures and rejections and the moments of humiliation that come along as part and parcel of this road. I doubt I'm the only writer who has flat out prayed for a book deal, but I might be the only one whose prayers queued up both a speeding ticket and the sure sense that if there is in fact a God who hears our prayers, he was flipping me off just like all those irate drivers I'd cut off on the freeway. Now, I always tell this story self-effacingly. It's a joke at my own expense, a witty little anecdote proving how humbled I was by futility, how good I'd become at embracing my own ridiculousness. But lately, I've noticed the subtext in it that explains a lot about what I was doing wrong as a writer for so many years. I'll take it like a man, I said. What did that mean exactly? What I came to discover was that many of my sins in both life and prose have sprung from an urge to imitate the romantic, macho rebel type of writer I admired, but don't really bear much resemblance to. By the time I started writing that second novel, I'd begun to accept something about myself. I am not an outlaw. I am a middle-class husband, a teacher, a coach, and a father of young girls. I'd become a much different kind of man than my chain-smoking, hard-drinking, libertine mentor Shikochis and his ilk. I know the words to all the kids' show theme songs on PBS television and the names of all the Disney princesses and their pets. I have come to regard Ratatouille, The Incredibles, and Elf as cinematic masterpieces equal, if not superior, to The Godfather and Citizen Kane. Instead of tough guys and outlaws in the Mountain West, I hang out with my little girls and my wife, with other parents and their kids. The biggest trouble I tend to flirt with is lingering a little too long with my teacher pals at Friday afternoon happy hour and arriving home a little late for another screening of Frozen. And of course, I spend my working hours here at MBA, a place which encourages what I believe to be a superior model of masculinity to the one that I'd previously subscribed to. It's a place where the boy in helmet and pads on Friday night writes poetry in his free time, and the champion wrestler is a gifted artist and singer as well. It's a place where expectations are high and ambition is contagious. It's a place where people are far more often than not earnest and generous and hopeful, when it would be easier to be bitter and cynical. And it's a place full of mentors who have meant as much to me as to our boys. When people ask me, for instance, how I managed to keep writing when I was teaching and coaching wrestling and experiencing a lot of rejection in the process, I just tell them about my friend Frank Simpson, the head wrestling coach, who reminds me every day by his example that the mark of a champion is not the victory, but the exhibition of a will to persist with dignity and resolve not to be broken by pain or disappointment. When they ask me why I get up so early in the morning, I tell them about my friend and mentor, Haywood Moxley, who is my role model, not just as a master teacher, but as a father and a husband and a deeply honorable man. Or I tell them about Brad Joya, who's probably the hardest working person I've ever met and who has led our community these past few months through serious illness with uncommon grace and fortitude. If I have to give up a little sleep so I can chase my dream and still do my job well and be present for my family, so be it. I wish I could have avoided the fender benders and the speeding tickets, but there's a price to pay for everything, I suppose. With those lessons learned, I turned away from the stoic antiheroes in the mountains and returned to a place I'd shied away from for years, the reason I'd ever wanted to be a writer in the first place. The origin of my book, Only Love Can Break Your Heart, dates back to 1978 when my half-sister, who I'll call Caroline, stole my 6-year-old sister out of her sickbed and disappeared. I have no recollection of that day. The story was told to me years later by my mother after Caroline attempted suicide by swallowing a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol capsules, and I was finally introduced to the many particulars of the tragedy that had been unfolding around me since before I was born. In 1978, Caroline was in her early 20s. She wasn't living with us anymore by then, but she was at the house frequently to do laundry or borrow money or maybe just to harass my mother, her stepmother, whom she hated for reasons that were both obvious and inexplicable. When Caroline showed up that day, my mother was in a bit of a bind. Our father was out of town on business. My mother needed to stop by the pharmacy to pick up medicine for my sister and to pick me up from preschool. She'd called several friends but hadn't been able to raise anyone, this being the days before mobile phones and even answering machines, when if you couldn't actually get somebody on the phone, you just didn't get in touch with them, right? Doesn't seem like that long ago, does it? Caroline offered to babysit. My mother didn't trust her, but rather than wake her feverish child and drag her out into the cold, she accepted the offer. When my mother returned maybe 15 or 20 minutes later, Caroline was gone, and so was my sister. Now, Caroline was what people used to call wild. A college dropout, she couldn't hold down a job or make up her mind about what she wanted to do with herself. She had a lot of long-haired, guitar-playing boyfriends who smelled like dope and trouble. She treated our father like an ATM and never let an opportunity pass to put him at odds with my mother. Unbeknownst to her much younger half-siblings, she had long exhibited behavior that suggested deeper issues than a wild streak. Threats of violence, teary ultimatums, arrests, hallucinations, and above all, unrelenting anger and sadness. In spite of all the trouble she caused, Caroline had always held a peculiar sway over me. When she still lived with us, she would often invite me into her room while she smoked and listened to her collection of classic rock records. She had long, straight hair then, parted down the middle like the young Judy Collins. She told me in confidence that I was her favorite, and I believed her. Why wouldn't I? Now, any parent who has lost a child for even a few minutes understands the agony my mother went through in those hours after Caroline ran off with my sister. Finally, with darkness falling, Caroline's car rolled up to the curb, stopping just long enough for my sister to climb out before speeding off down the street. My sister walked slowly up the sidewalk, still in her nightgown, clutching a Slurpee from 7-Eleven. My mother met her halfway on the sidewalk, embraced her, and asked her where in the heck she'd been and what she'd been doing. She said they'd just been driving around. She'd been bored but vaguely miserable, but was unharmed. Near the beginning of Only Love Can Break Your Heart, my narrator, who is 8 years old at the opening, whose name is Rocky Askew, is unwittingly abducted by his older half-brother, Paul, a charming but difficult 19-year-old with a troubled history and a taste for Neil Young and the Doobie Brothers on vinyl. Shortly afterwards, Paul disappears. What follows is my way through telling an imagined story rooted in truth, of wrestling with questions we all live with every day. How do we move on from the wounds of the past? What does it mean to love someone we can't help or save? Hence, I like to think of Only Love Can Break Your Heart as a faithful invention, a deeply personal fiction steeped in emotional truth, which I consider to be more accurate than the facts. For me, the art of writing, the art of fiction, comes down to being honest without telling the truth. I couldn't write truthfully about my half-sister. That story isn't mine to tell. Instead, I simply began with a sound and a place and an image that still haunts me. A small child in a car with someone she loved and trusted, oblivious to the hazards of love, jealousy, and madness. I think we read and write stories because we want to make sense of what bewilders us, about the people we love, about our families and communities, about the acts and moments in which we are shaped and scarred. I believe in these words wholeheartedly, but for most of my writing life, I didn't really live by them. Driving to work in the morning in my truck, I was drowsy driving, a dangerous menace, no less lethal than a drunk on a bender. But as a writer, I'd been asleep at the wheel, trying to write like someone else instead of getting down to the truth of what matters to me and what matters to us all. Okay, so I'm back in the truck, and that morning the blue lights are still kind of flickering in the cab. I'm sitting there. I've got my speeding ticket. I'm late for work. I'm just overwhelmed with self-loathing and disgust. I gripped the steering wheel and yelled out loud, "Would somebody please just give me a break?" Well, sometimes life gives you better than you deserve. This is a true story. That very morning, a solid month before I turned 40, I got a call from my agent, and my book had found its way into the hands of a brilliant editor and a wider group of people who have really nurtured it and supported it in ways that I couldn't have dreamed, and it has been a wonderful success and a great adventure for me thus far. When that big call from my agent came, I was actually in the middle of teaching a class, sophomore honors American Lit. Now, I promise I don't answer the phone when I'm teaching usually, but when I saw my agent's name come up on the phone, I knew it was a call that I had to take. I hope you'll forgive me. So I snuck behind my desk and talked quietly, trying to hide my excitement from the boys, and the boys were kind of over there pretending not to be eavesdropping. And when I put the phone down, they all looked over at me expectantly, and so I just told them, I said, I think I just sold my book. What happened next genuinely surprised me. One by one, the boys stood and started clapping and cheering. I sat behind my desk, blushing and flustered, too happy to stop smiling. It was as sweet a moment as it sounds, and here's why. When I recognized the pride and excitement in my students' eyes, I remembered why I started writing in the first place. Not for Cormac McCarthy or Robert Stone or Dennis Johnson, but for that little boy still inside me, full of hope and fear and love and hunger, who stayed up late at night reading the books that made him dream. Thank y'all.